Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we are going to talk about the differences between a bait casting reel and a spinning reel and when you should choose each one. There's going to be advantages and disadvantages to each one. I know a lot of people don't like using a bait caster. They start with a spinning reel. It's a lot easier and they don't want to either learn or they're having trouble learning a bait caster. So we're going to talk about why you should learn how to use a bait caster. And there's also people that really don't like using spinning equipment. I've seen it a lot fishing against guys in the South through college fishing, friends that I've met down from Alabama, Texas, areas like that. They don't like using spinning reels because their fish are a lot bigger and they have a lot heavier cover and they don't use those finesse techniques as much, but fishing those finesse techniques is key and you need a spinning rod to be able to do that. So we're gonna talk about all that in today's video and break it down in depth, so stay tuned and let's get right into it. So today we're gonna start with the spinning reel because this is what most people actually start out with fishing. Also, we're gonna go through the advantages and disadvantages of each. Essentially, what will be an advantage of one is probably going to be a disadvantage of the other, but we'll cover all that as we go through each reel. Starting off with the spinning reel, the number one advantage is it's just easier to use. It's a lot easier to cast a spinning reel. You just flip the bail over, make your cast, and you're ready to fish. There's no backlash. You don't have to thumb the spool, worry about braking systems, any of that. When you cast, the weight of the lure pulls the line off the reel, and that's all there is to it. It's a lot easier to use and more user-friendly. The other cool thing about a spinning reel that you don't get in a bait caster, this isn't much of an advantage because a lot of people don't switch back and forth, but the retrieve is interchangeable on a spinning reel. So I always use mine on the left, but you can actually flip it over to the right as well. In a bait caster, you get one or the other. You cannot change your bait caster. You have to buy a whole new bait caster. Like I said, that's not something you're usually going to run into, but sometimes when I fish with friends or family and they like a right-handed retrieve, I can hand them a spinning reel, take the reel off and put it on the other side, and they're able to use the same spinning rod that I have with me if they don't have equipment or anything like that. I would never be able to do that with a bait caster. The other probably biggest advantage of a spinning reel is your drag system. This is going to be entirely smoother than any bait caster you could ever find on the market. I don't even trust bait cast drag systems at all. I talked about that in a previous video, but I use the thumb bar entirely for my drag system on my bait casters. I don't use the drag. I crank it down. When I hook a fish, I will push the thumb bar like I'm making a cast and let the fish pull the line. With a spinning rod, you have a fine-tune adjustment right on the top here. If you hook a bigger fish or it rubs you up against a dock or something, you can get it out of cover and then turn your drag down and let it run a little bit and have more play in your drag. Or if you need to put a little heat on some fish, you can crank it up a little bit. A lot of times what I do when I'm fishing, I will actually crank it up a little bit tighter where it doesn't spin as easy so I can get a good hook set, and then as soon as I hook that fish, I will back it off just a little bit so that they have a little bit more play and I don't have to worry about them breaking that light line, especially when they get close to the boat. If you buy a good spinning reel, they will have an incredible drag system and you don't have to spend a lot of money either. This is a Shimano Sedona 2500, has one of the best drag systems I've used. It's ultra smooth and it will handle any type of fish that you could possibly catch and have that smooth drag that you need for that as well. My last advantage and favorite thing with a spinning rod is the ability to throw light line and light lures. Up here in the north, if you fish up here around the Great Lakes region, anywhere that has smallmouth, you know how much we fish those finesse techniques. We use a lot of Ned rigs, small swim baits, a lot of finesse plastics and other types of techniques that if you put them on a bait caster, you're probably not going to be able to cast them very far or cast them at all. With this, I can bomb a Ned rig pretty far just because the weight of the Ned rig is going to pull the line off the spool and I'll be able to get a far cast, especially with lighter line. So the real key is to put lighter line on the spool so it flies easier. I will put 15-pound test, even 10-pound test braid on here if I need a long cast. I always use braid as my main line. And then I will put a leader on the end of fluorocarbon for whatever pound test I think I need in those given conditions. But a 10-pound or 15-pound braided line is only like a 4-pound test diameter. So you can make a really long cast with a small spinning reel like this. I know there's a lot of the bait finesse systems out there nowadays. I have not played around with them yet, so I can't give my honest opinion on the difference between using the bait finesse system Baitcaster versus an actual spinning reel. If you'd like to see me actually do a video comparing the two, leave a comment down below. I will actually go out and get a bait finesse system set up. And we'll fish it up here in the Northeast and give it a true test if it's really worth the money, because if it cannot outperform a spinning reel up here in smallmouth country, it is not worth the money. But those are some of the main advantages when it comes to a spinning reel. The other thing is with your spinning rod, you're gonna have bigger guides. Typically, you can get a micro guide spinning rod, but usually they'll have bigger guides. So again, up here in the north, we'll fish in some freezing conditions where a bait caster might freeze up and you get like the ice shaver when you're reeling it in and it's just shooting ice particles everywhere while you're reeling it in. That's not really going to happen with a spinning rod because you're going to have a big enough guide that even if it ices a little bit, your line can still come through the guide just fine and still make a good cast. Some of the disadvantages of the spinning rod: you can't throw heavy baits. So pretty much you're maxed out at like a quarter, maybe 3/8 of an ounce. I've thrown 3/8 ounce finesse ball head swim bait heads on a spinning rod before, but I typically don't throw anything higher than a 1/4 ounce on my spinning rods. However, you're mostly fishing finesse techniques with this anyway. If you have other setups like a Baitcaster, you don't need to throw anything more than a 1/4 ounce. You also can't put very heavy line on here. The heavier the line you put on here, the more trouble you're gonna have with your spinning rod. If I were to put 20-pound test on this spinning reel, it's just gonna shoot off the spool because the line is too big for the spool here. So when it wraps around the spool, it has that memory, and when you go to cast, it's just gonna blast off the reel and create a bunch of knots and everything like that. You have to put some thinner diameter line on a spinning reel, or you have to get a bigger spinning reel. So if I really wanted to fish 20-pound test fluorocarbon on a spinning rod, which I would never do, I would have to get like a 6,000 size spinning reel. Then your setup is massive and you can't even fish properly with it. Mostly talking in bass fishing terms. Not to say you can't do this in saltwater and stuff like that. There is absolutely a time and a place to get a bigger spinning reel. That's why they're made. You can fish them in saltwater, but if you're fishing freshwater, that is one of the things to note. You got to have some light line on here. So if you need some heavier line, you're gonna have to go to a Baitcaster if you're fishing in some heavier cover or something like that. And now let's jump into the Baitcaster. A couple of the things that you can do here that are going to open up your fishing game a whole lot. I fish more Baitcasters than I do spinning rods. Not to say that they can be replaced. Like I said, I fish in the north. You have to have spinning rods up here. But I've fished many tournaments in the south that I have used spinning rods as well. I've caught 8-pounders in Florida on a wacky rig. I've fished Tennessee River lakes in the summer throwing a drop shot. I've fished Lake Hartwell throwing ball head swim baits and a drop shot all on a spinning rod. So there are places to use a spinning rod in the south. I highly recommend having those, but 90% of my fishing usually comes with a Baitcaster when it comes to bass fishing. The number one reason is just the control that this gives you. You can make a more accurate cast with this. When you throw a spinning reel, when you cast, that bait's going wherever it wants to go. You can feather the spool a little bit, but that line's coming off the spool as fast as it wants to come off. If you overthrow with a Baitcaster, you can just stop it with your thumb. Granted, you're going to make a big splash with your bait when you do that, but you can stop your bait at any point on your cast and let it drop in somewhere. So it allows you to pitch and flip. You can't do that really with a spinning rod. You could, but you don't have the control that you need with it or the accuracy. The other thing that a Baitcaster allows you to do is open up your line choices. So while you can only fish really light line on that spinning reel, I'll fish upwards of 20-pound test fluorocarbon or 65-pound test braid on a Baitcaster, and I'll fish all the way down to 10-pound tests. So I've fished 10-pound tests on a Baitcaster, throwing jerkbaits, crankbaits, stuff like that, 14, 15, 17-pound tests throwing spinnerbaits, Texas rigs, your basic all-around stuff, swim baits, everything you're gonna do, rattle traps, and then I'll go up to 20 or 65-pound braid if I'm flipping heavy cover, fishing in heavy grass. You can get fish out of places that you could never get them out of with a spinning rod by going to a Baitcaster setup. Again, I'm gonna crank that drag down. I'm not gonna trust the drag, so that is a disadvantage where you're gonna have to use the thumb bar on this. I use it to my advantage. I lose less treble hook fish by doing that, but it takes a lot of practice to do so. But the advantage of having your drag cranked down at all times, unlike the spinning reel, you have light line, you're gonna have to back that off or you'll literally snap your line on the hook set. You can crank this thing down all the way. You have 65-pound braid on here. You can hit a fish as hard as you want on the hook set. You are not gonna break your line. Your drag's not gonna slip. You're gonna bury that hook in that fish's mouth and get a really good hook set in some heavier cover and on single hook baits especially. If I'm fishing a single hook bait, 95% of the time it's gonna be on a Baitcaster. The only single hook baits I really fish on my spinning reels are very light wire open hook techniques like a drop shot, a Ned rig, and a finesse swim bait. The other thing with your Baitcaster is it allows you to throw heavier baits if you need to, but you can also throw more lightweight baits, so you have a greater range. I've thrown baits down to 3/16 of an ounce on a Baitcaster before. You might not get the furthest cast using a bait that small, but sometimes you might not need it. So I've thrown 1/4 and 3/16 ounce baits on here, no problem. Your 3/8 ounce range is really ideal, 3/8 to a half. You're gonna get very good casting distance and accuracy with that size weight. But I've thrown baits upwards of honestly like 5 ounces on a Baitcaster. If you're throwing A-rigs, you can throw big glide baits and swim baits, stuff that you cannot do on a spinning rod ever. You could never go throw a Huddleston swim bait on a spinning rod, but I can take this Baitcaster, put 20-pound test on it and slap it on a different rod because there's more rod options in your Baitcaster selection. I can slap it on a swim bait rod and go throw a Huddleston with it. I can take that same reel off that rod and go put it on a flipping stick and go flip bushes with a 3/8 ounce Texas rig and flip bushes with the same reel and do the same thing. So your range of baits opens up widely when you use a Baitcaster. It just eliminates that bottom range more. That's where the spinning reel would come in to replace that bottom range. So these two together gives you the whole range, but you're gonna have more range with the Baitcaster. More control, more range on line size, and more range on bait size is really what you're going to get out of a Baitcaster. And some of the disadvantages, like we talked about with the spinning reel, you're stuck with one-sided on a Baitcaster. So this is a right-hand Baitcaster. I can only reel with my right hand. So if I get someone in my boat, they don't have a Baitcaster, they want to try one, they can only try a right-handed option. They can't pick it up and go throw a left-handed option because it does not switch from either side. And the other huge disadvantage, if you're new to fishing or new to using a Baitcaster, is the difficulty of use with a Baitcaster versus a spinning rod. It's going to be a lot harder to learn. It's going to take a lot of practice to figure out how to use this thing and be able to make those accurate casts or those long casts without getting backlashes, having to cut your line out and re-spool and do stuff like that. But once you get that dialed in and you learn how to do that, it's not necessarily a disadvantage anymore. You will still get backlashes. I get them all the time. Anybody that says they are not getting backlashes are lying. It is absolutely something everybody does every single time they go out. One bad cast, one bad skip off a wave, anything like that, you will get a backlash with a Baitcaster. But if you learn how to dial it in and be quick with your thumb and stop them, you can most of the time just pick those out and get back to fishing. That's something you will have to deal with, especially as you start getting into using these Baitcasters here. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video breaking down the differences between a spinning reel and a baitcasting reel. Hope that helps you pick out when you want to use each one with your fishing techniques. Highly recommend just using both and learning how to use both. Even if you're in the South, you say, I don't need a spinning rod, I promise you will catch more fish if you try some of those finesse techniques some days. And if you're in the North and say, I only need spinning rods because I only fish finesse techniques, I've caught some awesome smallmouth using bait casting equipment as well. So I highly recommend getting both and opening up your fishing game. If you'd like to see a video on how to choose the correct rod to go with either of these reels and the right bait that you're using, go ahead and check this video out right here. Hit that subscribe button down below, and thanks for watching.